She smiled at me. That was all it took. A single look through the rear-view mirror, her lips curving in a way that felt meant for me. She sat in the back seat of my car that evening, holding her phone like everyone does, her face faintly lit by the screen. I can't remember what station the radio was tuned to or even where I picked her up, but I remember her smile. It wasn't much of a trip, just a few miles across town. She got out near a row of office buildings, thanked me, I think, but I was already thinking about her, about how genuine her smile had seemed, like she wasn't just being polite. She looked at me like I existed, like I mattered. After she shut the door and walked away, I stayed parked for a moment, watching her disappear into the building. I couldn't stop replaying the way her eyes met mine in the mirror. The city was full of faces, most of them forgettable, but hers wasn't. Her face stayed with me as I drove the rest of the evening, as I dropped off passengers who all blurred together, as I parked in my usual spot at the end of my shift. It stayed with me as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. The next evening, I found myself driving near that office building again. It wasn't deliberate, not really. I had a few hours to kill before the app started buzzing with ride requests, and I told myself it was a decent area to wait. I parked a street over, close enough to see the front door, but not so close that I'd stand out. I didn't expect anything to happen. I didn't even know what I was hoping for. And then she appeared. She walked out of the building with a bag slung over her shoulder, her phone in her hand again. She looked just like she had in the back of my car. Calm, confident, like she didn't have a care in the world. I couldn't take my eyes off her. She turned the corner and disappeared from view, and before I even realized what I was doing, I started the car and followed. I kept my distance. I knew better than to get too close. She walked for a few blocks before turning into a cafe. I parked on the opposite side of the street and waited. She stayed inside for about an hour, long enough for me to start questioning why I was still sitting there. But when she came out, I felt that same pull, that same need to be near her. She didn't see me as I trailed her back to her flat. She went inside, the door clicking shut behind her, and I stayed in the car for a while, just staring at the building. Over the next few days, I began changing my routes. I didn't think much of it at first. I told myself I was just trying to maximize my fares, staying in the busier parts of town, but I knew what I was doing. I was circling her workplace, her flat, the cafe she liked to visit. I started recognizing the same faces on the street, the same patterns of her day. I didn't pick up as many passengers as I used to. Sometimes I ignored requests entirely, letting the app beep and buzz until it stopped. None of them were her. The rides I did take felt meaningless. Strangers talking about nothing, leaving their rubbish in the back seat. I didn't want them there. I wanted her. Every time I checked my mirror, I imagined her sitting there again, her face soft in the light. Her smile meant only for me. It wasn't enough to watch from a distance anymore. I needed to be closer. One night, I parked outside her building after my shift and waited until the lights in her flat went out. I walked up to the door, pretending to check my phone in case anyone was around. The door was locked, of course, but I noticed the buzzer was old, the kind that barely works. I pressed a random button and waited. The door clicked open after a moment and I slipped inside. The hallway smelled faintly of damp carpet. Her door was on the second floor, third one down. I stood in front of it for a long time, listening for any sound from inside. It was quiet. I ran my hand over the doorframe, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers. I didn't try the handle. I didn't want to scare her. I just wanted to be near her. I started going back more often after that. I never went inside. I didn't need to. Just standing there, knowing she was on the other side, was enough. I began memorizing the way the building looked at different times of day, how the sunlight hit her windows in the morning, the glow of her lights in the evening. I learned when she was home, when she wasn't, when she left for work, and when she came back. It became routine, like a part of my life I couldn't give up. One night, as I stood outside her building, I saw her through the window. She was sitting on her sofa, her legs tucked beneath her, scrolling on her phone. She looked peaceful. I wanted to knock on the glass to tell her I was there, to remind her of that smile she'd given me. But I stayed where I was, hidden in the dark, watching her like I always did. The next day I drove past her workplace again, like I always do, but she wasn't there. I waited for hours, parked just out of sight, but she never came out. I drove by her flat that evening, but her lights stayed off. I didn't see her at the cafe, didn't see her anywhere. It's been days now. I keep going back, retracing my steps, waiting for her to appear. She'll come back, she has to. People don't just disappear, not people like her, not people who smile like that. It wasn't hard to create someone she'd fall for. She'd always been predictable in that way, like a book I'd read so many times I could recite whole chapters by heart. I knew the kind of man she wanted, the type she thought she deserved. The trick was to make him just different enough from me to seem fresh, a little more thoughtful, a little softer around the edges, someone she'd trust. It began with a profile, carefully constructed, every detail chosen to catch her eye. He was into hiking and photography, someone who loved quiet nights as much as spontaneous adventures. I borrowed pieces from the men she used to talk about, the ones she thought I hadn't noticed. A favorite band here, a travel destination there, just enough to make him seem real. It worked better than I expected. She responded to my message within an hour. I'd written it casually, pretending to stumble upon her profile like it was fate. I said something about her love of art, how rare it was to meet someone who appreciated the older stuff, not just the trendy pieces everyone pretended to like. She loved that, ate it up, really. From there, it was easy. She opened up quickly, just like I knew she would. I'd always admired how trusting she was, how willing to share herself with someone who seemed to care. She told me about her job, her friends, even little things like how she spent her weekends. I already knew most of it, of course, but it was good to hear her say it. It made the lie feel more real. I made sure to be patient, to keep my distance at first. She'd been cautious after our breakup, more guarded than usual. I could tell she was testing me, looking for signs of the things that had driven her away before. I wasn't going to make the same mistakes. I told her about my childhood, a mix of truth and fiction that painted me as someone she could feel safe with. I let her take the lead, let her feel like she was the one steering the conversation. It was important she believed she was in control. When she finally agreed to meet, I made sure it was somewhere public, somewhere she'd feel comfortable. I kept my voice steady, my smile easy, hiding the thrill that coursed through me when I saw her walk through the door. She looked different than I remembered, softer somehow, but with a hardness in her eyes I hadn't seen before. It didn't matter. She still smiled when I stood to greet her, and that was enough. The first few weeks were perfect. She was hesitant at times, but I knew how to draw her out, how to make her feel safe. I played the part well, better than I'd expected, honestly. She told me about her past relationships, about the man who had hurt her. She didn't say my name, but she didn't have to. I listened carefully, nodding in the right places, apologizing for things I hadn't done but knew I should have. It wasn't until later that I started slipping in the little reminders, nothing too obvious at first, just a phrase here, a habit there. I'd touch her wrist when she was upset the way I used to. I'd hum along to a song we'd danced to once, acting like it was something I'd picked up somewhere else. I wanted to see if she'd notice. She did, eventually. It started with her questions, little hints of suspicion she tried to hide. I could tell she was trying to piece things together, trying to make sense of the things that didn't quite add up. I made sure to stay calm, to act like I didn't notice the way she watched me sometimes, her brow furrowed in thought. The moment she realized was almost disappointing. She'd come to my flat for dinner, her laughter trailing off as she spotted the photo on my desk. It was one of her favorites, an old shot of a sunrise over a lake we'd visited together. She didn't say anything, but her face changed, a flicker of something cold passing over her features. She didn't stay long after that. The next day, her messages were shorter, her responses delayed. She started cancelling plans, claiming she was too busy with work. I let her pull away, knowing it would only make her doubt herself more. She'd always hated confrontation, always second-guessed her instincts. I waited for her to block me, to cut me off completely. She didn't. Instead, she started posting more on social media, pictures of her with friends, captions about how happy she was, and it was for my benefit, of course. She wanted me to see, to believe she was moving on. I liked every post. I still drive past her flat sometimes, just to see if her car is there. I know she's looking over her shoulder, waiting for me to appear. It's only a matter of time before she reaches out again, before she convinces herself she overreacted. She always comes back. When she smiled at me the first time, it felt like sunlight breaking through a crack in the wall. She didn't even seem to notice what it meant, how rare it was for someone like her to look my way. Most people don't. I'm the boy sitting in the corner with his head down, the one no one remembers when they're listing names for group projects. But she saw me, and that was all it took. Her name was written at the top of her notebook in neat, curly handwriting. I stared at it a lot during lessons, running my eyes over the loops and swirls, feeling like I'd learned something secret about her. Her pen moved quickly across the pages, filling them with notes and doodles in the margins. She tapped it against her desk when she was thinking, a soft rhythm that seemed to echo in my ears long after it stopped. We sat next to each other in English class. I didn't choose the seat, there weren't many left when I came in, but it felt like it was meant to be. I could tell she was kind from the way she smiled when I mumbled hello. I didn't expect her to talk to me, not really, but then she did. At first it was just little things. She'd ask to borrow a pen or pass me a worksheet when the teacher handed them out. She always said thank you, her voice quiet but warm. I started carrying extra pens in my bag just in case she needed one. When she forgot her book one day, I slid mine between us so she could see. Our arms brushed as she leaned closer and my skin burned where we touched. It was hard not to notice her outside of class after that. She had a habit of twisting her hair around her finger when she was concentrating, and I'd see her doing it in the lunch queue or while chatting with her friends. They were loud, always laughing and pushing each other around. She didn't seem like them, though. She was softer, quieter, like she didn't quite fit in the way they did. I started hanging around places where I knew she'd be. It wasn't on purpose, not really. It just felt good to see her, even if she didn't notice me. I'd sit on a bench near the school gates, pretending to scroll through my phone and watch as she walked past with her friends. Sometimes she'd laugh at something one of them said, and the sound would stick in my head for the rest of the day. The bus stop was another good spot. She took the number 22 home most days, and I started timing it so I'd be there too. I stayed back, keeping a few paces behind her in the queue. Once I ended up sitting just across the aisle from her. She didn't look at me, but I spent the whole ride staring at the back of her head, memorizing the way her hair caught the light. When I found out where she lived, it wasn't on purpose. She got off the bus and I didn't think, I just followed. Her house was small and neat, with flower pots on the windowsills and a blue front door. I walked past it 3 times that night, my heart racing with the thought of her being just on the other side of the wall. The closer I got to her, the harder it was to stay away. I started showing up earlier to class so I could catch her coming in. I'd hold the door open for her even though my hands shook when I did. Once I reached out as she passed, my fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. She didn't pull away, but she didn't look at me either. Still, it was enough. I wanted to tell her how I felt, but the words wouldn't come. Every time I tried, my throat closed up and I could barely breathe. So instead, I left little notes on her desk when she wasn't looking, just small things. You look nice today, or I like your handwriting. She never said anything about them, but she didn't throw them away either. That had to mean something. One day, I decided to walk home the way I'd seen her go. I knew it was risky. Someone might see me, might wonder why I was there, but I couldn't help myself. The streets were quiet, and her house stood out against the fading light, the blue door glowing faintly in the dusk. I stood across the road, watching her bedroom window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the shadow of her moving inside. I started going there more often, always at night when no one was around. I never got too close, just stood on the pavement across the street, my hands in my pockets. Sometimes I'd imagine knocking on her door, telling her everything I couldn't say in class, but I knew I wasn't brave enough for that. The last time I tried to talk to her, she looked at me like I was someone she didn't recognize. I'd reached for her hand in the corridor, desperate to feel that warmth again. She pulled away sharply, her face pale, her eyes darting around as if she was afraid someone might see. She avoided me after that, switching seats in class and taking a different route home. I don't understand why she changed. I thought we had something, even if it was small, even if it was just between us. But now, when I see her, she turns her head and walks the other way. She doesn't smile at me anymore. I still go to her house sometimes, standing in the shadows where she can't see me. I just need to know she's there, that she's safe. Even if she doesn't want to talk to me, I'll keep watching over her because she's mine. She just doesn't realize it yet. The arrangement had been her idea, though I doubt she ever believed it was mine too. She was the one who wanted a clean break, splitting everything neatly into halves like you could divide a life with a dotted line and a pair of scissors. I agreed to it all without much of a fight. What else could I do? She'd already made up her mind. Shared custody seemed fair, she said. Fair for the boy. Though we both knew he was too young to understand any of it. He just wanted his mum and dad in the same place. It wasn't about fair, it was about control. She wanted to control when I could see my son. How often, for how long. She wanted to keep me at arm's length. I went along with it, kept my voice steady and my tone polite during the mediation meetings, all the while feeling the knot in my chest tightening every time she looked at me like I was a stranger. I wasn't a stranger. I knew her better than anyone, better than she knew herself. I just had to remind her of that. The schedule she came up with was neat, like something she'd copy-pasted from a parenting blog. Tuesdays and Thursdays were mine, every other weekend too. Drop-offs at 6 o'clock sharp, pick-ups the same. No room for spontaneity, no flexibility. She was always rigid like that, obsessed with plans and routines. I used to admire it. Now it grated on me, like a lock she kept snapping shut between us. It started with small changes, things she couldn't really complain about. I'd show up 15 minutes early, saying I wanted to spend just a little more time with him. She never said no outright. She didn't want to be the bad guy, but I could see the way her face tightened when she opened the door and found me standing there. It wasn't just about him, though. Not really. Her house was smaller than the one we'd shared, tucked away at the end of a quiet street. The windows were always clean, the curtains drawn at the same angle, like she was trying to prove how put together her life was without me. It annoyed me, that smugness, the way she acted like everything was fine now. Like she hadn't turned our lives upside down. The first time I stayed after drop-off, it was because the boy didn't want me to leave. He clung to my leg, crying, and I told her I'd wait until he calmed down. She didn't argue, just crossed her arms and stepped aside while I settled him in his room. I lingered in the doorway, listening to her moving about the kitchen, her footsteps soft against the tile. I started showing up unannounced after that. Not often enough to seem strange, just enough to keep her guessing. I'd bring something for him, a toy, a book, and use it as an excuse to check in, to see how she was doing. She'd sigh and let me in, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she never turned me away. I knew she wouldn't. Her routine was easy to figure out. She left for work at 8 o'clock, dropped him off at nursery on the way. Some days she worked late, not getting home until after 7 o'clock. On those evenings, the house felt different, quieter somehow. I'd park a few streets over, walking past every so often to glance at the windows. The lights came on like clockwork, kitchen, living room, bedroom. She was nothing if not predictable. It wasn't spying. It was making sure she was safe, that she wasn't doing anything to hurt herself or him. When she started seeing someone new, I noticed right away his car was parked in her driveway on a Friday night, still there the next morning. I didn't like the way it looked, out of place beside her little hatchback. Too flashy, too arrogant. He stayed over more often after that, and I found myself driving by more frequently just to see if his car was there. The sight of it turned my stomach. He didn't belong there. He didn't know her the way I did, didn't understand what she needed. The boy didn't like him, I could tell. He never mentioned him, not once, and that silence spoke volumes. I brought it up during drop-offs, making offhand comments about how he seemed quieter lately, more withdrawn. I asked if everything was all right at home, letting the question hang in the air just long enough for her to feel it. She brushed it off, of course, but I could see the doubt flicker in her eyes. One evening I let myself in. I still had the spare key. She must have forgotten to ask for it back. The house was dark, the air still. I wasn't planning to stay long, just wanted to check on things. Make sure he hadn't been leaving his stuff lying around, that she was keeping things tidy. I found the man's jacket draped over the back of a chair in the living room, his shoes neatly lined up beside hers by the door. The sight of them sent a rush of heat through my chest. It wasn't right, him being here. I didn't take anything, didn't move anything. I just stood there for a while, breathing in the familiar smell of her house, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. When I left, I made sure to lock the door behind me. A few nights later, her bedroom light flickered on just after midnight. I was parked further down the street, out of sight. She stood at the window for a long time, her silhouette framed by the curtains. I watched her until the light went off again, the house sinking back into darkness. I knew she'd seen me. The house was already mine before she moved in. It's important to know that. I'd been there long before the for sale sign went up in the front garden, long before she arrived with her boxes and her bright ideas about fresh paint and new furniture. It was quiet in the beginning. That's what drew me to it. Just an old house with sagging gutters and creaking boards, the kind of place people overlook where no one asks too many questions. I found my way in one night through a broken window in the cellar. Nobody lived there then, and I don't think anyone had in years. It was a forgotten house, and I needed somewhere to be forgotten. The attic was perfect, dry, tucked away with plenty of corners to disappear into. There was a hatch that led down to the rest of the house, but I didn't bother with it much. I'd come down only when I needed something, scrounging for whatever the last owners had left behind. The fridge was empty, but there were tins in the pantry, a jar of peanut butter, some stale crackers. I made it work. I always make it work. When she showed up, I wasn't worried. People come and go in places like this. I thought she might be another estate agent or a builder checking the place over. But then I saw a car parked out front, the way she unpacked her things, stacking boxes in the hall. She was young, maybe mid-30s, with that look people get when they think they're starting fresh. I watched her through the gaps in the attic boards, through the little vent that faced the garden. She had no idea I was there. She moved around the house, humming to herself, unpacking her life piece by piece. It was almost funny to watch her settle in, to see her rearranging furniture and hanging curtains, as if the place belonged to her. The first few nights I stayed completely still, listening to the sound of her footsteps below. She stayed up late, wandering from room to room, probably too wired to sleep. I could hear her moving things around, her kettle boiling, her phone buzzing faintly in the kitchen. It wasn't long before I needed to come down. My supplies were running low, crumbs at the bottom of a bag of crisps, an empty tin of baked beans. I waited until she was out one day, maybe at work or shopping, it didn't matter. I crept down through the hatch and into the kitchen. It was strange to see the house filled with her things. Plates stacked neatly on the counter, a basket of fruit on the table. I took an apple and a granola bar from one of the cupboards. Nothing she'd miss. It became a routine after that. Whenever she was out, I'd slip down to take what I needed. I was careful not to disturb anything, to leave everything exactly as I'd found it. I didn't want her to notice, but sometimes it was hard to resist. She left her post unopened on the table, letters and catalogues spread out like an invitation. I didn't take anything, not at first, but I started looking, running my fingers over the edges of her life. She had no idea how much she was sharing with me. One night I woke to the sound of her moving around below. It was late and the house was dark except for the glow of her television. I couldn't see the screen from where I was, but I could hear the flicker of voices, the faint crackle of static. I stayed still, pressed against the attic boards, listening to her shift on the sofa. She got up after a while, heading to the kitchen. I heard the fridge door open, the clink of glass. I held my breath, waiting for her to go back to bed, but she didn't. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. I couldn't see her, but I could feel her presence below, the way she paused before shutting the fridge. When she finally went upstairs, I exhaled. Things changed after that. She started noticing. She'd come into a room and hesitate, her eyes darting around like she was trying to catch something out of place. Once, she opened a cupboard and froze. Staring at the contents for so long, I thought she might empty it out completely. I'd been careful, but maybe not careful enough. I started moving less, staying in the attic for longer stretches. The space felt smaller with her below, the air closer, the floorboards more fragile. I could hear everything. The sound of her phone vibrating on the bedside table, the shuffle of her feet on the carpet, the way she sighed in her sleep. She wasn't loud, but the house amplified her, made her presence inescapable. One night I went down while she was asleep. I told myself I'd be quick, just long enough to grab a tin of soup and some bread. But as I stood in the kitchen, I heard something that made me freeze. It was faint, barely audible, but it came from the direction of the hallway. I turned, my heart pounding, and saw her standing there in the dark, her outline framed by the dim light spilling from the street lamp outside. She didn't move. Neither did I. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, separated by a few feet of empty air. I don't know if she could see me fully, or if I was just a shape to her, a shadow against the faint glow of the window. And then she took a step forward. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to the attic, but I did. My chest was tight, my breath shallow as I pulled the hatch closed behind me. I lay there in the dark, my ear pressed to the floor, listening for her, but she didn't follow. She didn't even call for help. She just stood there for a while, and then I heard her go back to bed. I haven't come down since. I'm not sure what she thinks she saw that night, if she's pieced it together or convinced herself it was just a trick of the light. But I know she feels me now. I can hear it in the way she moves, the way she hesitates before going into a room. The attic is quiet, but the house isn't. It never is. That smile. It wasn't anything remarkable, just a brief, almost absent-minded curve of his lips as he stood in line at the cafe. But something about it held my attention. There was no purpose behind it, no one he was directing it towards. It was the sort of smile a person wears when they are lost in their own head, unaware of the world around them. And I thought to myself, here's someone who doesn't realize how much he gives away. He was just a man, not especially handsome or noticeable, but there was something about the way he carried himself. It made him seem separate from everyone else in the bustling cafe, even as he blended in perfectly. He was alone, as I often am, but he didn't seem lonely. I wanted to know more about him. When he left the cafe, I followed him, not far, just enough to see where he went. It was simple curiosity at first. He walked to the bus stop, boarded the 47 and sat by the window, his head resting against the glass. I stood a few paces away, just outside his line of sight. I hadn't planned anything, hadn't thought further than seeing where the bus would take him. He got off in a quiet part of town, the sort of neighborhood where the streets are lined with small shops and terraces with overgrown gardens. He disappeared into one of the buildings, a grey block of flats with faded paint. I stood outside for a while, staring up at the windows. I didn't know which one was his, but it didn't matter. I knew I'd see him again. After that, I started going to the cafe more often. It was easy enough to blend in, to sit in the corner with a cup of tea and pretend to read a book. I wasn't sure if he'd notice me. I didn't think he would. He seemed the sort of person who barely registers the people around him, and I was right. He came in almost every morning, ordered the same thing, and left without ever looking my way. It wasn't enough just sitting there watching him. I wanted to be closer, so I started following him again. I learned his patterns quickly. He took the same bus most mornings, always to the same stop. He walked the same route to work, a modest office building with frosted glass doors. In the evenings, he'd come home, usually with a bag of groceries or takeaway. Sometimes he stopped at the pub on the corner, sitting alone with a pint, staring at the television in the corner. I never got too close. I didn't want him to notice me, not yet. I just wanted to know him, to see how he lived. It was almost comforting how predictable he was. It made me feel like I belonged in his world, like I could slip into the spaces he didn't even realize were there. One evening I followed him home again. I stood across the street from his building, watching as the light in his flat came on. He didn't pull the curtains. Most people don't, not when they think no one is looking. I could see him moving about, setting down his bag, turning on the television. He sat on the sofa, his feet propped up on the coffee table, the flicker of the screen reflecting off the windows. I stayed there for hours, long after his light went out. I didn't feel the cold or the ache in my legs from standing. I only felt the pull to be closer. I needed to be inside, to see the things he kept hidden behind those walls. The next time I went to his flat, it was late. The street was quiet, the only sound the occasional rumble of a car passing in the distance. I stood outside his building staring at the buzzer panel. I'd noticed before that the main door didn't latch properly, that it could be pushed open if you gave it the right nudge. I slipped inside, the stale air of the corridor pressing close. His flat was on the second floor. I stood in front of the door, my hand hovering over the handle. I didn't have a key, of course, but I'd come prepared. The lock gave way after a few moments. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me as quietly as I could. The flat smelled faintly of detergent and something sharper, maybe the remnants of whatever he'd cooked that evening. It was small but tidy, the kind of place that doesn't reveal much about the person who lives there. But I could feel him in every detail: the scuffed trainers by the door, the stack of receipts on the counter, the half-empty bottle of water on the bedside table. I didn't touch anything. I didn't want to disturb the space. I just wanted to feel what it was like to stand there, to be in his world. I moved through the flat slowly, taking it all in. The living room, the kitchen, the bedroom. It felt like I'd stepped into a photograph of his life, frozen and still. When I left, I felt different. Lighter maybe, like I'd crossed a threshold I couldn't step back from. I started going back more often after that, always when I knew he wouldn't be there. I began to notice the small changes he made, the books he moved, the groceries he brought home, the way the cushions on the sofa were rearranged. It felt like I was a part of his life, even if he didn't know it. Then, one night, something happened. I was standing in his flat again, the television turned off, the room bathed in the faint glow of the streetlights outside. I was staring at the screen at the faint reflection of the room behind me when I saw movement, just a flicker, barely there, but it was enough. I turned, my heart pounding, but the flat was empty. I stood there for what felt like hours, every nerve in my body on edge, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Eventually I left, locking the door behind me, my hands trembling. I haven't been back since, but I still think about him, about the way he looked that day in the cafe, about the way his flat felt in the dark. I know he's noticed me now. I know he's seen me. And I can't help but wonder if he's waiting for me, just as I've been waiting for him. I've always been good at keeping quiet, slipping in and out without being noticed. It's a skill you develop when the world turns its back on you, when you have to make your own way. People see me as ordinary. That's my advantage. They don't remember the man who stands to the side, who doesn't speak much, who knows when to lower his eyes. They forget me before I'm even gone. It didn't start out like this with her. At the beginning, I thought she saw me, really saw me. She laughed at my jokes, even the ones I knew weren't funny. She touched my arm when I spoke, smiled at me in that way women do when they're trying to tell you they're safe with you. But I don't think she ever truly understood what we could have had, what we did have, before she threw it away. I watched her leave me behind just like everyone else. She thought she was clever about it, slowly pulling away like I wouldn't notice, but I did. I notice everything. When she left my flat for the last time, I knew it wouldn't be the last I'd see of her. I couldn't let it be. The first time I returned to her place, I stood in the hallway outside her door for what felt like hours. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. I just wanted to be close to her again, even if she didn't know it. The sound of her kettle boiling, the faint creak of her floors. These small things felt like a balm to me, something I could hold on to when everything else was slipping away. I didn't go inside that night, but soon it became too much to stay out there, lingering like a ghost in the cold. She'd forgotten to change the locks, and her window was easy enough to reach. It wasn't like I was breaking in. I wasn't there to take anything. I only wanted to be where she was, to feel the warmth of her life again. Her flat felt different when she wasn't there. It was smaller, quieter. Still, there were traces of her everywhere. The scent of her shampoo in the bathroom, the faint imprint of her body on the sofa cushions. I would sit there sometimes, just for a moment, to feel what it might have been like if she hadn't given up on me. The first time I touched her things, it wasn't planned. I saw her favorite mug on the drying rack, and it felt wrong that it wasn't being used. So I moved it, just a small thing, barely noticeable, but it made me feel like I was part of her life again, like I still mattered. After that, I couldn't stop myself. Little by little, I left marks, a crease in her duvet, a strand of my hair on her pillow. I thought she might notice, but if she did, she didn't say anything. It made me bolder. I started going back more often. Each time when I knew she'd be out, I didn't do anything drastic. I didn't want to scare her. I only wanted her to feel my presence, to remember me in the ways that mattered. Then I saw the photos on her phone. She left it charging on the kitchen counter once while she went to work. It wasn't locked. I don't think she ever expected anyone to look. There were dozens of them. Pictures of her friends, her nights out, even a few of her with another man. That one hurt, but it was the ones she'd taken in her flat that caught my attention. In one, her reflection was faintly visible in the dark screen of her television. And in the corner of that reflection, just barely, you could see me. It was from a week before. I remembered the night clearly. She'd come home late, tipsy from a night out. I'd been standing just beyond her balcony, watching her from the shadows. She didn't know I was there, but her camera had caught me. It felt like a sign, proof that we were still connected in ways she didn't understand. I didn't take the phone. I didn't delete the picture. I wanted her to find it, to realize that she hadn't really left me behind, that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shut me out completely. Now, when I go to her flat, I wonder if she's noticed yet, if she's seen the photo or the mug or the faint indent on the sofa where I sit. I imagine her standing there, looking at her things, trying to understand what's changed. The thought makes me smile. It's not about revenge or anger. It's about being close to her, about showing her that I'll always be there, even if she doesn't want me to be. The road was endless, just a ribbon of asphalt cutting through fields and hills, disappearing into the horizon. That's what I liked about it. There was always somewhere to go, always another bend, another town to pass through. I didn't have a destination in mind most of the time, I just drove. She was the reason I started heading east. I caught sight of her outside a service station near Bristol, leaning against her car, flipping through a map. She looked like she was made for the road. Her hair tied back, sunglasses perched on her head, a pair of hiking boots scuffed from use. The kind of person who didn't stay in one place for too long. I liked that about her. I hadn't planned on following her. It just happened. She pulled out of the car park a minute or two after I did, and it felt like the sort of coincidence you can't ignore. Her car, a small red hatchback, stayed in my mirror for a while before overtaking me on a stretch of dual carriageway. I got a better look at her then, focused, her hands steady on the wheel. I wondered where she was headed, what her story was. The thought of losing her unsettled me. I had nowhere important to be, so I stayed behind, keeping her taillights in view. She drove fast but not recklessly, as if she was comfortable on the road, like she belonged there. We passed through a few towns, nothing more than clusters of houses and a petrol station or two. She didn't stop, neither did I. It wasn't hard to stay with her, though I made sure to drop back if traffic got too thin. I didn't want her to think I was following her. I wasn't, not really. I just wanted to see where she was going. The sun began to sink low, stretching the shadows across the road. Her car signaled and turned off onto a smaller road, winding through farmland and clusters of trees. It wasn't the kind of route I'd normally take, but I stayed with her. The landscape felt different, quieter. The kind of quiet that makes you notice the sound of your own tires on the road. She pulled into a petrol station as dusk settled. I drove past, my heart racing as I caught a glimpse of her stepping out of the car. I circled back after a few minutes and parked a bit further down the road, far enough that she wouldn't see me. I waited, watching her through the reflection in my wing mirror. She went inside, bought a drink and a bag of crisps, and came back out. When she pulled out onto the road again, I followed. By the time she reached the motel, the sky was deep blue, the stars starting to poke through. She parked near the front office, grabbed a small bag from the back seat and went inside. I waited a little way down the road, my fingers gripping the steering wheel, the engine idling. The motel was a squat, two-story building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. Her car was easy to spot, parked near the far end where the rooms stretched out in a row. I didn't follow her inside. Instead, I drove around to the back, parking in the shadows where my van wouldn't be noticed. I sat there for a long time, staring at the dashboard, trying to decide what to do. She didn't know I was here. She didn't know I'd followed her all this way. That thought made my chest tighten, the same mix of fear and excitement I'd felt the first time I saw her. The motel went quiet as the night deepened. A few lights flickered off in the rooms and the sound of distant cars on the main road faded. I slipped out of the van, walking carefully along the back of the building, keeping to the edges where the light didn't reach. Her room was easy to find, the curtains drawn, but a faint glow coming from inside. I stood there for a long time, just listening. Eventually I went back to the van. The air was cool and I sat with the window cracked open, watching the motel from a distance. I didn't sleep, couldn't. When morning came, the motel stirred to life. Doors opened and shut, cars started and people moved about. Her car was still there, parked exactly where it had been the night before. I got out of the van and leaned against the door, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. She came out a little while later, her bag slung over one shoulder. She froze when she saw the van, her body tensing. Her eyes scanned the car park, then darted back to the vehicle in front of her. I wondered if she recognized it, if she remembered seeing it in her mirror the day before. I stayed where I was, hidden from view, watching her through the gap in the curtains I'd hung across the van's windows. She hesitated, her fingers gripping the strap of her bag tightly. Then she turned, heading back towards the office. I didn't move, didn't breathe, and then she was gone.